you. So today I wanted to talk about the things that you can do to grow grit within your organization. And the first one is really the concept that leadership is practice. It is deliberate, consistent practice, which is something that Duckworth really talks about in the context of this book, that talent is one thing, but practice over time with passion is really the key to real significance in leadership. So remember, when you get stuck, to continue to practice what you're doing. I find it really interesting with a lot of the coaching clients that I have. We talk about some of the things that they can improve on, and we talk about them and we see each other every other week. And when I ask them how they're doing with things, they might get stuck because they forget the concept of practice. So my first tip for you today is to remember that leadership is an intentional practice. My second tip for you today, oh, hi, some friends. My second tip for you today is really to celebrate your small wins. And I have been really guilty of not doing this in my career working in nonprofits. What I find is that we're on this vicious circle. So we go from one board meeting to the next. We go from one fundraising to the next. Event to the next. We go from one campaign to the next. And we very rarely stop and say, wow, this is something we need to celebrate. We've done a great job. And it can be pretty demoralizing for our teams if we actually don't stop and acknowledge and celebrate their small victories. And so again, as part of creating a consistent culture, one that shows the test of time, as Duckworth talks about, I encourage you to create as many small victories as you possibly can within your organization so that you can celebrate your mission and celebrate those successes. The third area that I wanted to talk about today is how you develop a growth mindset within your organization. And for me, this book really did a great job of combining a number of other experts in this field together. One of the other experts is a woman named Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset. And what we know about leadership is that we need to have a growth versus a fixed mindset to be effective leaders. And oftentimes when I'm working with nonprofits, I find this to be really the bane of their existence. So I hear a lot of, this is what we've always done, or that won't work with our clients, or, you know, our donors don't really like us to do things that way. And it drives me crazy, because really what a growth mindset about is finding and pursuing ways to continue growing. So it doesn't matter how long you've been with your organization, how many years your mission has been around. It's so critical to continuously build a mindset of growth within your organization as a leader. Another area that is important in terms of taking grit to the nonprofit world and taking Duckworth's learning to this space is around self-discipline. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is something that I used to question about with myself. I am notorious for starting projects and not finishing them. People will tell you that as I was growing up, I would start different crafty projects, different needlework projects, and I loved the art of starting, but I really wasn't good at finishing. And Duckworth really talks about the importance of continuing and persevering through things and persistence. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what self-discipline looks like in leadership. I think one of the most important things is really continually putting the mission out in front of people as a way to be disciplined in the choices that you make. So I talk a lot about something that I call the shiny bright object. That's hard to say. The shiny bright object syndrome, which is something that nonprofits really suffer from. This syndrome is all about finding the next thing that's out there, with funders especially, that might give more money to your organization. So that looks good, that looks good, that looks good. And so we go after what looks good and what is sparkly and what is new. And we can really get taken off mission if we aren't very disciplined around keeping things disciplined and focused and consistent. Now, that's not to say that you should just take on any, not be creative and not be innovative, but it is really important to ask good questions, very deliberate, focused questions around self-discipline and the why behind the choices that you make when you're looking at building your mission. One of the last things we want to suffer from is mission creep. And again, based on Duckworth's work, we know that we need to be consistent over time and perseverant over time and passionate over time about our mission. So again, practice self-discipline. I also really encourage you as a leader to work on self-discipline. So for me, for example, doing this podcast or this live video and writing takes a tremendous amount of self-discipline. I very much am somebody who works by inspiration. And so to know that I have to come up with something once a week really requires me to put some tools in place that keep me on task and alignment with my goals for this business. Another thing I recommend for you to do as a leader is to think about things that are hard for you and practice them. So for example, I oftentimes work with emerging leaders who are like, I don't like doing something. So I remember being an emerging leader and really not liking financials. And that's because I didn't have a ton of experience in looking at financials and financial reports. So my suggestion would be to do something that makes you uncomfortable and do it regularly. In this particular case, I'd say every week, sit down with your CFO, if you're the leader, and ask her to explain something to you that you really know nothing about. And make it a discipline, make it a habit to push yourself out of your comfort zone. Another thing that I would really consider you to think about as a leader is reconsider how you give feedback. And this was one of my favorite parts of Duckworth's book. And she talks a lot about it in the context of parenting. And I know we have some new parents on our call as well as great leaders. And so I really recommend this book as a parent. And she kind of uses this great sense of humor in the way that she recommends giving feedback. And again, this is something that I've really had to practice. So I am an overly enthusiastic, yay, you've done a great job with something person. But Duckworth really talks about creating language that encourages people to be persistent and to continue challenging themselves. So let me give you an example. When you delegate a task to somebody who has never done something, instead of letting them off the hook and saying, you know, it's okay, you can do this next time, you can really use the way Duckworth talks about language differently. So you can talk about, I know this is tough for you this time. It's going to be better the next time. What can we do to work together to make sure that you're successful? So I think that we oftentimes take the easy way out, which is around letting people off the hook. And this particular practice of considering the way you provide feedback can be really important here. And finally, as a tip for practicing grit within your organization, I would say go back to basics. As my friend Frances Hesselbein says, mission, 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 mission. And everything that we should do is based on understanding our mission. Be creative about how you remind yourself and your stakeholders about mission, but go back to the basics of the why of what you do. Remember, our organizations take a long time to make impact. In my blog, which I'll be posting later today, I talked about my time at Habitat for Humanity at the Lehigh Valley. Hey, Jess. Hey, Cal. And I talked about the fact that it wasn't a quick gratification organization. So when we worked with our homeowners and our families, we talked about an 18 to 24 month process. So think about that as it applies to both your families and your stakeholders, like your staff and your volunteers. There's not a quick and happy outcome, which means that you really have to figure out how you stick with things and keep the mission front of mind as you go through projects that take a long time. The work we do in nonprofit organizations takes consistency, persistence, and passion. And we have to continually remind ourselves what these things are on a daily basis.